Okay. So, welcome everyone to Howling Coyote. And I'm really happy to have Louise Harding with me today. And she's writing some really interesting papers, to me at least, on um, sort of indigenous ideas about mind, brain, and thought, and how that relates to contemporary neuroscience. And so I discovered her work uh, doing a search on indigenous philosophy of mind and thought, wow, this would be a good discussion to have. So, Louise, can you say a little bit more about yourself and your work and how you came to this place in your scholarly life
For
and
sure.
things like that? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me on. It's a great pleasure. I'm familiar with your work through the scoping review I did. So it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with you about it. There's just a truck going by in front of the house here, but I think we'll be okay. So I'm Louise Harding, as I said. I am based at the University of British Columbia in Canada, in Vancouver, on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I myself am a settler. So my mother's parents immigrated here from England, and my father immigrated from England. And the paper you found, the scoping review about Indigenous people's perspectives on the brain and mind globally, was a project I undertook that ended up um, being a big part of my master's thesis in population and public health, which I actually defended yesterday. So it's part of a larger piece of work around, as you said, brain and mind and connections to neuroscience. And the way I got into that kind of work was I was completing an undergraduate degree at UBC in biopsychology or behavioral neuroscience. And I grew up not having much understanding around colonization and settler colonialism or things like what it means to be a settler on unceded Indigenous land. And then in Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which toured the country. And that was in 2013 when they came to Vancouver, and the university gave everyone a day off to attend that and listen to the testimonies of residential school survivors. And when I attended that, that really shifted something for me to understand more about what had happened in the country. And I started a process of learning at that point and took on a minor in First Nations and Indigenous studies and worked in the First Nations and Endangered Language program, and then with youth in a nonprofit association for 2 years with Indigenous youth. So then when I wanted to come back to research, um, I I was really fortunate to find a role with Dr. Judy Illes at Neuroethics Canada at UBC, and to start creating a project kind of at this niche where I had experienced this tension in my undergraduate degree between what I was learning in my neuroscience courses and then the politics and history I was learning in my Indigenous studies courses, and I wasn't feeling them coming together. And I had kind of carried this separation with me. And working in the community, I didn't really keep much of the neuroscience part. Um, and in this project, this work actually catalyzed out of a conversation with Dr. Malcolm King, who's based at the University of Saskatchewan and is a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we were talking to him about um, actually access to neurosurgery for Indigenous and rural and remote populations in Canada. And he brought up the question of, has anyone looked at the topic of brain health yet with Indigenous communities? And does it mean the same thing in Indigenous philosophies as it does in Western biomedicine? So a field like neuroethics is based on the idea that the brain is exceptional and requires its own ethical field when it comes to medicine. But does that same belief exist in some Indigenous communities? And how does mental health fit in that, as that's often a big priority for Indigenous communities? So we took on a scoping review to start to see has this question been um, approached yet, or what aspects have been approached? And actually, your article with elders around, I believe it was mental health training, was a really favorite of ours, especially mine and co-author Katerina Morrow, in terms of the depth of exploration around. It kind of got the closest out of all the papers to exploring the key questions we had going to the work.
Oh, that's really nice to hear. I'm 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 always thrilled when somebody reads one of my papers. One of my colleagues did a study and discovered that on average an academic paper is read by 7 people.
Hmm.
So, yeah, um so tell us, I think people listening would really like to know, you know, a bit of compare and contrast of indigenous notions of mind and brain compared to conventional neuroscience. So,
Mhm.
can you do a bit of comparison and contrasting?
Yeah. So, um, in the scoping review study, we looked globally. So we were looking not at select Indigenous communities, but about literature about any Indigenous community around the world. Um, so I'll just say that what we learned was based on the 66 communities we found papers about, and um, there's probably some generalizability to other communities, but there's always a lot of diversity and so on. But one thing a few things we noticed, particularly as some members of our team have this background in neuroscience, reading these papers, some key themes that were different from the Western biomedical neurological sciences papers we normally read were certainly a more holistic view on brain health. So not the same focus on the brain in isolation, if that makes sense, just the individual neuron firing and chemicals, more in relation to it could be the land, relationships with a very important one, and family. Um, Spirituality was a big one that came up that you don't normally see in Western biomedical papers, often outside of the purview of Western philosophies in the same sense that you see it in Indigenous philosophies, and um, and also wellness and well-being rather than health or cure, looking for a cure. That was something different we had. So papers around, for example, talking about mental wellness or brain wellness in aging versus more looking at specific fixes or um, diagnosable pathologies in the brain. And we did elaborate on this in a subsequent project. So the scoping review led into, which was the biggest part of my thesis project, is a Indigenous brain wellness and mental health working group, which we set up last fall. And so there were 20 people in the working group from our networks, including elders, healthcare providers, people who work in the community, and people who live with brain and mental health conditions or have lived with them. And we talked about the meaning of brain wellness in an Indigenous health context to get more into this question. And 2/3 of the group members were Indigenous, and everyone works with Indigenous peoples in that context. And definitely, again, the big one that came up was, we came in with this targeted question about what is the meaning of brain wellness, but people talked about all sorts of different things. So in answering this question about brain wellness, people were talking about environmental hazards. They were talking about intergenerational trauma and intergenerational strength, um, political aspects. So it was like a much wider view on brain health than we typically are seeing in neuroscience, which was really satisfying for me to see because I think the challenge I had in my journey studying the two at the same time was neuroscience was so narrow, and I was struggling to see how it fit in this bigger picture of Indigenous people's well-being um, and me being a settler on an Indigenous land and how I can support and do better and realizing that if we blow up and expand that view of neuroscience, there's a lot to work on there, and there's a lot of connections.
Yeah, it makes me think about the whole area of dementia, and and so in conventional circles, there's so much focus on finding a drug and these neurofibrillary plaques, and yet the literature is so much more robust in terms of sense of belonging, or
Mm,
you know being in a community, or exercising or eating well. And uh, it strikes me that that's that's so much more compatible with indigenous thought and so ignored by conventional medicine, sort of conventional research strategies,
mm,
which there's a way I'd love you to react to this and to say more, but there's a way in which in the conventional world it's so narrow. You know, the the brain is isolated from
mm,
everything else. And in
mhm,
indigenous thought, you know, it, everything is embedded, contextualized. Um, there, you can't talk about something without talking about its environment. Where is it? Um,
mm.
can you say some more? I mean, do you agree? And can you say some more in relation to that?
Yeah, that was a big takeaway for many of us from the working group, was we can't talk about the brain without talking about all the other things, and even things such as what brings us to a discussion about the brain. So the positionalities of the people even discussing the brain, and um, dementia and aging. That was quite a large focus. So I think it was 1/5 of the papers in the scoping review had a main focus on dementia or aging. So it's right, you rightly pointed that out as a key area in this body of research with Indigenous peoples. And it was even larger in Canada. So there's a lot of research in Canada, First Nations communities, research with communities around their traditional ways of knowing about healthy aging and so on. For example, Dr. Jennifer Walker was part of our group, and she's doing a lot of really interesting research around, for example, intergenerational social engagements to support healthy brain aging. And that was one paper that came up in our scoping review as well. And separately, I'm working on a scoping review around the connections between Indigenous languages, whether it's speaking or revitalizing languages or learning languages, and health overall. And definitely one I've seen come up there that has linked these two studies has been healthy aging, because often it's elders and older people who are carrying the languages. And one thing actually being that making sure that they have access to care in those languages being important, but also how it can really help them if they are if they can hear their language around them. And there's some really interesting papers I'm seeing coming up around that, around the reactions of people who are Indigenous language speakers, and maybe they have dementia and they're not very responsive. And then someone comes in an English clinic or hospital setting, and then someone comes and speaks their language to them, and they kind of come alive and they start reacting in different ways, that that it was believed wasn't within the possibility of where their current brain health was. So I think like all these things connect, like it brain health, and then you can talk about languages and um, resurgence and healing, but also things like colonization and racism. It's all in there, and definitely in our working group discussions, it was quite broad, and a lot of the even changes we were talking about as a working group. What can we do? What should we take on? And a lot of the things we talked about were very big systemic changes, like you talked about. Of there's this incompatibility. You could look at it in that way between indigenous ways of knowing about brain and health and the Western biomedical ways. Or I think it might be more useful to look at it as more of the Western systems rigidity of um, being very focused on the organs and a certain way of looking at health, and the need to be more open and to break down prejudices that are preventing us from looking at these other connections to brain health. And just a big thing I heard in the working group was the need for Western medicine to respect Indigenous ways of knowing. And there was a lot of hope there of where that can lead and where it is leading in some good case examples right now.
Yeah, and you make me think of two-eyed seeing, which I
Hmm.
know is permeating Canada,
Yeah.
the idea and the term.
Hmm.
And we're actually creating a center for two-eyed seeing with the University of New Brunswick,
Wow.
which, um, which is kind of an interesting partnership because um, the border um, is not indigenous. You know,
Mm.
that
Hmm.
the Pescada people live on both sides of the border, as do
Mm.
the Maliseets and the Mi'kmaq. And to to them, it's an arbitrary line. And and so anyway, it's kind of exciting for us to think about a partnership that's Wabanaki, which is the
Wow.
the overall term of for the tribes here, nations here.
Hmm.
And you reminded me too that I forgot to mention that I'm speaking from the unceded homeland of the Penobscot Nation, and that I should acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future. So, a bit of rudeness on my part. Apologies to spirits who are listening. Um, but I think there is a lot to say about two eyed seeing. And
Hmm.
everywhere I go, um, people mention that the conventional or the biomedical way of seeing is always privileged.
Hmm.
And it's always an uphill battle, or, well, usually a battle to get the indigenous perspective acknowledged.
Hmm.
And, and, um, and no one, I mean, I think no one wants to diss bench research or the
Hmm.
fMRI machine.
Hmm.
But but as you're saying, there's more to the brain than the changes one sees on an fMRI,
Hmm.
however interesting they might be.
Hmm.
And yeah, I wondered if we could venture into. Um, I wanted to move more toward thoughts about unwellness. The that sort of comparison of um, sort of emotional unwellness in indigenous thought versus conventional thinking.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I suspect that you ventured a bit into that too.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the working group, it just makes me think a little bit about what one of the elders shared quite a lot about. Her name is Sharon Jinkerson Brass, and she's a member of Key First Nation in Saskatchewan. And she talked a lot about lost connections with spirit of um, many Indigenous peoples, and she shared her own story around this. And one thing I think about a lot that she shared was about how our society is based in a lot of fear, um, a lot of ideas of right and wrong and hierarchy. And in Indigenous cultures, it's a lot more about humility and compassion. And she even used the word about fearlessness, which I thought was really beautiful. And she talked about her own quite in length about her own journey, which I won't share too many details of, but just that she talked about learning from her grandmother how not to be afraid anymore. And and I think that was a big piece for me in learning in those working groups. And I report, to the extent of what I've said in my thesis with their consent already. And that that was a different way of looking at it that you don't hear about in the Western medical sphere. And it leads to a different path of healing from that kind of thing is very different from going to the doctor and getting a prescription. And so the kind of um, it kind of goes down the path of healing from states of unwellness, what that might look like for each person. And um, it was shared by another about the need for self-determination in those healing pathways. So in an Indigenous person engaging with the Western medical system, if they would like to, that's their choice. And how they would like to do that, would they like to bring in their Indigenous healing approaches and integrate that with their Western medical treatment, or would they like to pursue that in parallel and to create their own journey? Because I think it does come back to what you're kind of describing here as a different, if you're looking at the problem you're bringing differently, um, I could imagine if you don't have an exact agreement philosophically with the physician or nurse or Western medical professional you're working with, um, there'll be different goals and different end goals there. So I think that's very important to consider that and have those options for yeah, for healing from different types of seeing and experiencing unwellness.
Yeah, and I know one of our struggles here, and and besides being with the University of Maine, I work for Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, which is the public health district for the First Nations of Maine. And one of our challenges is to indigenize psychology and psychiatry.
Mm, mhm,
And and it's a challenge because so many of our community members are completely colonized in their thinking about psychiatry and psychology. So we're trying to get them to think in terms of verbs, that however feelings are part of a process, and they're thinking that they have these nouns, and they come in and announce,
mm,
that their bipolar is acting up, or their
mm,
PTSD is out of control today, you know, and
mm.
and um, it's quite a challenge to 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 try to reorient them toward. Um, so let's look at what's going on in your whole life around you, and what are your emotions responding to, and and it may not be that there's this thing called PTSD, you know, that's controlling you today. But uh,
Yeah.
did that come up in any of the discussions? That sort of um, need
Yeah.
to decolonize the whole diagnostic and treatment enterprise?
I think it came up. That's definitely something I think about a lot, and I don't know if that came up directly, but it did come up in the sense that one member, Dr. Nell Wyman, who practiced as a psychiatrist and is now a public health leader in the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia, talked about that her training as a Western psychiatrist, um, Western psychiatry training only provided her with like 50% or less of what she needed to work in the First Nations community she went to work in. The other part of the training was from learning from the healers in the community. And she said the way that they approached it was working very closely with those elders and healers, that was the only way to go about it. And she talked what one of the most moving things for me in that group was she talked about that when they brought together the healers from the community with these Western psychiatric approaches, they were not only meeting the standard of care set by Western medicine, but they were able to exceed that. And I think what you're talking about of this idea of, going beyond the idea of something like PTSD and looking deeper into that, I think that's where that kind of like key is to getting even beyond what Western medicine is imagining we can do with healing from different states of mental unwellness, and that's definitely an area of great interest to me, and I think to many people right now is we're seeing in the scoping review, and I think all over you hear that many Indigenous communities are interested in um, mental health, mental wellness, and experiencing challenges related to colonization and racism and oppression and so on, which are leading to states of mental unwellness, and how to heal from that. But and yet, I think um, everyone is experiencing that Western biomedical approaches to mental health aren't always the most effective. They're not really. Maybe this is getting more into my opinion, that a lot of the Western psychiatric approaches to mental health conditions are not always super effective, and it's can be much more effective to look more broadly and more relationally, spiritually, all these sorts of different aspects. And I think there's some key knowledge in Indigenous cultures and communities around um, healing that really needs to be brought in, because I think that's, there's some things Western medicine is really good at, and a pacemaker to prevent having another heart attack, like a deep brain stimulator for Parkinson's disease. There's some things which are, very effective, and I think everyone is grateful for these advances, or most people are very grateful for this. But then there's other things where I think mental health, I think pain is another one. Chronic pain is another one that we struggle with. Recovery from substance use disorders. There's some different ones that Western medicine really struggles with. And there's like a key area of need for incorporating other perspectives there. But I think what you're describing a little bit um, is kind of back to what I experienced, in my undergraduate degree, is this rigidity of the one way of seeing, um, health or the brain, for example, being around neurons, diagnoses that are in a book, which is like a sort of Bible for diagnostic conditions of brain and mind, um, and a rigidity in not being able to look beyond that. And that can actually be really hinder us from um, understanding each other and helping each other and ourselves.
Yeah, and and it it made me think of one of your other papers, um, where you raised the question of how do we measure evidence, you know,
mm,
among Indigenous partnerships. And I thought of um, a conversation I had in another podcast with Walter Lindstrom from CAMH in Toronto. And he was talking about his frustration that when that the only evidence that the biomedical people would accept would be a randomized control trial. And
mm,
how would you do a randomized control trial
mm,
of traditional healing? You know, um, because the traditional healer wouldn't even necessarily accept the allopathic diagnosis. And,
mm, mm,
I was
mm,
telling Walter about
mm,
an elder I took to a conference once in Alberta to be on a panel, and a nurse in the room asked him how he would treat arthritis, and he said, "I don't know her. Bring her around to the house tomorrow, and I'll get to know her, and then I'll let you know." Yeah. So so if you can't even agree on
mm,
you know diagnosis, then how can you
mm,
communicate? You
mm,
know, and uh, to me, it's a wonderful opportunity to open people's minds, but maybe not to the closed minds on the other end of the stick. And I wondered if
mm,
you could talk to what
mm,
you learned about measuring evidence.
mm. Yeah. Um, are you referring to the paper around? So we wrote one
Indigenous-led healthcare partnerships in Canada.
oh yeah.
Oh, that's
So
not your paper. I'm sorry.
yeah, we just wrote a
Oh,
response to this very interesting paper. Yeah.
I guess I saw your response and I thought it was your
It
paper. But
was a
what's,
great paper though. I'm glad you looked at it.
yeah, and one of my
Yeah.
students is a co-author,
Oh,
Andrew
wow.
Atala. How about
Really? Wow.
former students? One of
Yeah.
my former students.
Amazing. Yeah. The
Yeah,
lead author, I believe. Yeah,
how
the
about
first
that?
author.
Well, that's so funny that I thought that was your paper. Well, tell me what you guys had to say about that paper.
Um, well, so that paper was written just before the pandemic, and then we were starting our project of the working group when during the pandemic. So we were encountering challenges around there wasn't guidance in the literature yet around, for example, consulting with elders on Zoom. This isn't something that was, there was an established protocol that we were aware of around doing something like this. So we were looking to hold sharing circles, but then we were realizing we were going to have to hold that over Zoom. And Dr. King had experience from being involved in projects as the pandemic was evolving and had picked up some strategies that we could use in that context. Um, but that so what we were seeing in that paper that we were responding to was about how the the importance of these Indigenous led partnerships in the healthcare space in Canada and how they're really defining health research and the healthcare landscape in Canada are these innovative ways that Indigenous communities are working, whether in partnership with federal or provincial programs or within their own communities to promote health. And so we were thinking about, what does this look like now that we're in a time of COVID-19? What does this continued, community work look like if there's no in-person contact? So we just wrote a short letter around some things, a few examples we had learned about, for example, healing circles of how those were being done during a time of Zoom or of video conferencing, such as recording something beforehand and giving it to participants to do at a certain time, and the use of different approaches overall for upholding ceremonial protocols like the gifting of tobacco, doing that virtually, whereas before it would be done in person. So it was just a short response that we wrote to that letter. But the letter garnered that article got a lot of responses. It was a very they covered a lot of ground in that paper. I think it was quite impactful.
Yeah, it was a good paper, and I'm sorry that I thought you wrote it, but it was a good paper. I,
Maybe I wish I did.
yeah, don't we all? Well, we have to, you know, we can't all write the same paper. Yeah, it's but yeah, I was thinking about our challenges in, we're really trying to decolonize our public health district.
Mhm,
And it's not easy because the the various health clinics in on the different reserves typically have locum doctors who come and go
mm,
and are relatively uninterested in the indigenous perspective.
mm,
And
mm,
you know um, we're we work deeply in substance use disorders, and where we can, um, to some extent, con- affect the philosophy of treatment. Um, but it's hard,
mm,
that,
mhm,
and as we've been talking about, you know, pill pill giving and taking is privileged,
mm,
and when you think about it, that's part of the substance problem is is that people grew up learning that when you're distressed,
mm,
um, pop a
mm,
pill or
mm,
drink something
mm,
or inject something. And um, this notion of which I think is a more indigenous notion of sitting in the midst of distress, distress
mm,
tolerance, um, is completely alien to them. It's not something
mhm.
that they grew up
Yeah.
around, you
Mhm,
know, which is our challenge,
mhm,
really, is to change that perspective on what do you do when you're upset or
yeah.
what do you do when you're sad,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm,
Um, we were just talking in a meeting before you and I began about how about drug use during wakes, when
mm,
people die, and and how how can we how can we reduce that? Like, what do we
mm,
need to have in place
mm,
around
mm,
a wake and a funeral
mm,
to provide options to people for for actually tolerating their sadness and their loss,
mhm,
so as to reduce the use of substances.
mm,
But
mhm.
yeah, so um, what other can you give me some examples of places and things that you discovered that are working?
Yeah. One really nice example in Vancouver actually right now that we heard about in the working group in detail was it's called the Kilala Lalem Health Clinic, and it's in the downtown east side, which is a very impoverished postal code. A lot of people are experiencing homelessness and struggling with substance use down there. And they have a really innovative model. And the executive director, Dr. Leah Walker, was part of the working group. And I got to visit a few weeks ago as well. And they're opening a substance use clinic across the road very soon because they've had a lot of success with their model. This is more towards that what I heard in that context around substance use is more around low barrier access to safe supply. So in the downtown east side, that is a big one because there's a lot of issues around criminality because so many people are needing drugs and the only way to get them is illegally, and all this stuff. And so big thing happening down there is safe supply, injection sites, and so on. So there's some really amazing stuff going on down there. But at the same time, they have elders embedded into their multidisciplinary clinic, which is a really beautiful model. So you can go in every day and sit in sessions with elders. They have like group sessions. They have meals happening twice a day where you can come visit with the community while you're picking up your medication, or you can just come and visit. And counselors embedded with the doctors. And even though a lot of doctors and nurses coming in through the system might not have the awareness and education yet around Indigenous healing and perspectives and so on, they are providing that training when they get to the clinic and really supporting those healthcare providers throughout, with the real perspective that everyone is on a learning journey. So always discussing cases and what could have been done better. But I think that this is a really challenging one. And I notice when you're speaking about sitting with the stress, the picture of the Buddha in the background you have there. So this is definitely something around the world. And I think it is a very colonial mindset. I think saying that myself as a British person, I think this is something we see a lot in British culture. And I think even around the idea of the British leaving England when they had used up so many of their resources, it was very crowded and dirty, and the impetus to go and set up a new world overseas versus working on repairing their own society and like regenerating that. And it was to do a lot of very terrible things to move Indigenous people off the land so that there could be a new society there. I even like make a connection here, and I think that that this mindset of reaching for something rather than understanding what we're really feeling and what's really going on is a big thing there. And a lot of counseling approaches certainly deal with this, and I think a lot of elders, this is something they're working around a lot. It does sound like in my other review, like learning languages, there seems to be quite a lot of evidence around and every community is different in terms, every Indigenous community is different in terms of where they're at with their language and whether one could access learning opportunities and so on. But there is some pretty good evidence that we're finding in the scoping review to support whether it's you having fluency or ability in one's Indigenous language and lower rates of substance use or mental distress or psychological distress. And there is a really interesting study happening in Australia right now where they've done the closest thing to kind of a randomized control trial they could around learning your Indigenous language and a community revitalizing their language. So the community where the language was sleeping. So they're looking at the whole community, looking at the people who are engaged in the revitalization and reclamation, and then the people who chose not to be involved in it, and then measuring mental wellness. And it was having positive effects already they're seeing. So And this is certainly something we saw in the scoping review and the working group, which is around um, culture as intervention. And that's something they're at that clinic downtown as well. And that's something I think that's very important and unique, because, yeah, this colonial healing from the colonial mindset, um, trying to look for a way out through the, colonial tools of psychiatry and so on. I think that that doesn't always that doesn't always work so well. But many Indigenous communities have these amazing rich cultures and languages, and spiritualities and philosophies, and communities have always known this, and the research is catching up now, I think, to see how that can impact things like mental wellness, reducing substance use, and yeah, tolerating, unbearable distress like what you've described, which is challenging for everyone.
I think it was Christopher Lalonde at UVic who
Yes.
found, yeah, that
Mhm.
communities with intact language had virtually no suicide.
Yes, yeah, they studied British Columbia, Chandler and Lalonde,
Hmm.
and they were looking at youth suicide rates because they saw that how variable it was. Some communities have way below, any international rate of youth suicide, and some communities the rate was way above, despite this kind of general belief that Indigenous communities have higher youth suicide rates. They're actually seeing that it's a very mixed landscape, and they looked at um, the language factor. So I think it was that whether 50% or more of the people in the community have some ability in their Indigenous language. Um, they were looking at census data. I believe that's the how it worked. And those communities that had the 50% or less had there was almost zero youth suicides in those communities. What that study really shook the field, and I think that was in 2004 or 2007. And that was a big reason we took on the scoping review, actually, the language and health one, because that one study is called on so much and it had limitations and so on. And we felt that there must be more literature out there. And we have 240 studies right now, which are providing, many of which provide similar evidence for this link between language and health.
That's wonderful. I, I'm, I hope you publish a list of all those studies so I can go
Yeah.
find them.
Yeah.
That you're
The
looking at
fun.
all this. I noticed in one of your paper you were talking about building a database.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Is that still a project and how are you coming with it?
Yeah. So in the project we took on in shaping the brain and mind scoping review was around identifying the challenges of actually finding literature about Indigenous people because of all the different terms you could use, all the different definitions for Indigenous peoples. And the best thing would be to put in the name of every Indigenous community you'd be interested to learn about, but that information isn't always available. And sometimes each communities have multiple different names and different spellings and so on. And so we had suggested one thing which would be really useful as a database that indexes um, literature about all Indigenous peoples around the world. And you could just search for anything like, yeah, substance use recovery or something, and find only papers about Indigenous peoples. We, I haven't seen any progress on this. I think we thought this would be a great thing to do, but I think the resources are a big challenge there. And the paper, though, has received a lot of attention. That has been definitely my biggest paper. It's according to the online metrics you get. But one thing that they have made progress on is the University of Alberta has made these lists. I believe they have them for Canada, the US, Australia. So it's starting with these settler colonial countries, um, of big search strings with the names of all the Indigenous communities. So you actually can like do a big copy paste So if you want to know about in the United States of all the nations and tribes on a topic, they have created a document where you can copy paste the name of every nation there, and so you're more likely to get a balanced outputs about different communities. So that's good, and it looks like they're doing more and more countries.
That would be impressive to see. It would be a long,
It's very long.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
it is a challenge because one has to type in Indigenous and then Aboriginal and then
Hmm.
First Nations and then Native American and then
Hmm.
American Indian and Alaska
Hmm.
Native. And well, you would know this better than me having done the scoping review.
Hmm.
But it's tedious to look for papers, you know, with all
Hmm.
these different terms.
Yeah. And if you try to go globally, it's even a bigger challenge. So even the definition of indigenous, if you go to Africa or Asia, different definitions would include or exclude different groups in these places. So that was a huge challenge of would groups in Africa that were considered under the definition of indigenous that we adopted, which for the study, which was the United Nations definition, be included in the word if we put the word indigenous? Like, was the article tagged with indigenous? So it would have been, yeah, that was a big challenge for us, and we didn't find a huge number of papers from Africa or Asia, and that might have been one of the reasons why. Versus, I think in Canada, the United States, and South America, the definition is quite easy to apply because colonization has been more recent and more, um, yeah, a very different history of colonization than Asia and Africa, and of just movement of peoples, not always colonization. Mm.
Yeah, and I suspect Africa had a different, so it would have been the French and the Belgians and
British.
British also, right? Yeah, whereas in the English speaking countries it was mostly the British.
Mm-hmm.
That may influence terminology.
Yeah, and then there's even in Africa and Asia, for example, in Asia, the Han Chinese movement and moving out indigenous communities there, and in Africa, similar things of um, communities, a lot of movement. So we'd look at a community in a country and then find out that that community has been there for example, 500 years or 1,000 years. And in if a country had been there for 500, if a community had been there for 500 years in somewhere like British Columbia, they're indigenous because Canada has only existed for 150 years or so. But with these much longer histories there, you have these very different cases.
Yeah, there was a podcast I did with a fellow named Mofat Osoro from Nairobi, Kenya.
Mm,
Um, and he came from an indigenous community about 300 kilometers, I think, east of Nairobi, but it could have been west.
mm,
Um, and he experienced conventional healthcare in Nairobi and decided to bring indigenous healers into a clinic that could work as the primary source of healthcare with the conventional medicine people as the secondary backup helpers.
wow.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah. If you Google
Yeah.
my name and his name together, I think the podcast will come up.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Yeah.
it was pretty impressive, and um,
Mm.
so I know people are working in these ways in Africa, but
Mm-hmm.
it's I stumbled upon him, um, you know, as I was looking for, literature, as I do. So, um,
Wow. It's a very different context I think in the African context, from the few papers we found about brain health in from the African continent, um, there was a lot more around, for example, more supernatural understandings around, for example, epilepsy, the cause of something like epilepsy being more related to someone's actions or inaction in a certain case, or interaction with a certain um, animal or plant, or something the family did, or something like that. And it did talk more about, I did definitely see papers there about more use of the traditional healers in rural communities. So uh, it it does sound, it was almost to the point of, do these is this useful to bring this set of papers into our set of papers with um, North America and South America, where we're seeing kind of different themes, but um, yeah, definitely different scope there, but there were some similarities, I think, of definitely like what you've described, this interaction with the biomedical approaches to healthcare
Yeah.
and challenges of, for example, a physician working with someone who believes that epilepsy comes from a supernatural origin, and they can't have agreements around, if it comes from a supernatural origin, how would a pill heal from that? The kind of like um, challenge there.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
He,
yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, he told us about his three grandmothers who were still doing traditional healing
Mm.
in their community in their 90s.
Wow.
Yeah, and I thought, cool.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're
Yeah.
getting close to the end of our time. Anything that you haven't told us that it's really exciting you right now, or what's your next project, or uh,
um, yeah, I think that's been a really great conversation, and really exciting to speak with you and talk about this topic. Quite a new one to think about. Um, I guess the thing for me in the project, and a big focus, especially in my thesis, overall, has been about focusing not only on the content, which is what we've discussed a lot about today, but around like how we go about learning about these views from Indigenous peoples and developing these knowledges. And that was one thing we liked a lot in your paper. And I used a quote that we included in the paper on several PowerPoint conference presentations and posters, which is around the ethics, like a research ethics board requiring consent forms and so on. And the elders you're speaking to, so it was something along the lines of that. If you listened and understood and took the knowledge with you, they felt that was good enough. But the university requires that they sign away a consent form, a waiver of liability, and all these kind of things. And that being kind of funny for them, but it was a kind of a funny way you wrote of that they humored you in engaging in
right.
the process. Um, but yeah, for me, the process of the project, and especially the working group, was more about how to bring together Western knowledges and Indigenous knowledges in a respectful space, in a way, in a space where people feel listened to from a variety of backgrounds. How me as a settler scholar can be organizing such a project without, while minimizing the imposition of my epistemologies and ontologies that I inherently bring as a non-Indigenous person, things like this. So I guess yeah, that's just an important piece to me, is around that developing the knowledge is important, but in a way that is actually, really Indigenous community driven, and really working with communities on their goals, and collaborative, and the long term vitality of those connections has been a key part. And I felt that in your work as well. And I think, yeah, moving forward in the field, I think that's a key piece to keep a hold on is even as, exciting things are evolving and so on, it's all about doing right by the process of that work and how that can actually be more impactful at the end of the day than a academic paper or something else like that.
Right, right. We forget that doing good in the world is more important than amassing publications.
Yeah. And especially in the context of the, research abuses with Indigenous communities, which,
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I'm sure that's what the Research Ethics Board had in mind of, that's why they wanted you, in your case, to go through the consent form process and all that is because of the historical challenges, even though the community said, no, we are comfortable. That's not what this is, and we know that.
Yeah,
But
I remember.
it's still a
Mhm.
challenge.
I remember telling the ethics board that if they weren't in agreement, they wouldn't even talk to me.
Yeah.
They would just walk away.
Uh,
They didn't really understand the cultural, how the culture would have acted if they didn't want to do it.
and there's some very exciting stuff happening there. Some of my classmates I've heard about of bringing a research ethics board to a community to actually work on the ethics application with them in person and see this is our community. This is the context of what we're telling you because it could be very rigid of, they have to write, the community has to write their own, they have to create their own research ethics board to approve it and so on. But the community is saying, no, we're completely comfortable with this. For example, and they see we've done these ceremonies and this to us is equivalent or actually better. So I think that's an exciting area for me right
That
now
is
is
exciting. That
yeah.
is exciting. That's an idea that I'm going to tuck away.
Yeah. Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
thank you
Thank you
for,
so much.
yeah, thank you. And I'm thrilled that you guys used my paper. Uh, anyway, I'm happy that it was useful.
Yeah.
So,
So
thank you.